Thank you. Hi, I am Whitney Snow, and I am the managing editor of the Law Review here in Memphis. And I am here to introduce Professor Steve Mulroy. He's a University of Memphis law professor, teaching, among other things, constitutional law, civil rights, voting rights, and election law. He is a former attorney for the voting section of the U.S. Department of Justice. And he's also a former elected member of the Shelby County Commission here in Memphis, where he oversaw a redistricting. He's also the author of a new book, Rethinking U.S. Election Law. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mulroy.
Should I put this one on? Yeah. And here's the, oh, great. Can you just check me out? Am I turned it on? Is it working correctly? It should be. Okay. Can you hear me through the loudspeaker system? No? How about now? Okay, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. First thing I want to do is thank the students of the University of Memphis Law Review for putting on such a great symposium. Why don't we go ahead and give them some appreciation right now. Yeah, they don't get the appreciation they deserve, so I'm really glad that they did this, and I appreciate this forum to talk about some of the ideas in my book. I want to make a preface that I'm going to start out with some examples of what I consider to be anomalous election results. They happen to redound to the benefit of the Republicans. At an earlier time in our history, they would have redounded to the benefit of the Democrats, and who knows in the future what they'll do. But I want you to try to put partisan politics aside if you could. I'm really not trying to make a brief for one party or another. I'm trying to make an argument that there's a fundamental flaw in our election system and that there's ways that we can improve it so that it is more accurately reflective of the popular will. My proposal will help Republicans in Democratic states and Democratic districts, and it will help Democrats in Republican states and Republican districts. Okay? Nationally, though, the examples may point in one direction, but please don't be fooled. Right? So I want to start out by talking about what I consider to be three anomalous election results. One of them you're familiar with. You've all heard of the fact that in 2016, our last presidential election, 3 million more Americans voted for Hillary Clinton, and yet Donald Trump became president. What not all of you may be familiar with is that sometimes similar counter-majoritarian results happen at the U.S. House and U.S. Senate level. So, for example, in 2012, more Americans voted for Democratic House candidates, and yet Republicans retained a 30-seat majority. It's a little bit harder to count that in the Senate because only 1/3 of the Senate is elected per election because of staggered terms. But pick any three consecutive elections in the last decade. Let's just take the first three. Same thing. More Americans vote for one party, another party retains a solid majority. These are counter-majoritarian results. I think they're counterintuitive. I think most people would say that that's not really a fair representation of popular will. What I'm here to tell you is that there's a fundamental flaw in our election system, common theme that explains all of these results. And that is this. Whenever you take a jurisdiction, county, city, state, United States, whatever, and you carve it up arbitrarily into subunits, and then you hold a winner-take-all election within each subunit, you are naturally, inherently, inevitably going to get what I call a skew. That is to say, the overall voter preference in the jurisdiction will not perfectly accurately reflect the actual number of seats that one party or another gets. And we could talk about party, we could also talk about race, ethnicity, ideology. No matter how you slice it, there's going to be a skew. The skew at the Electoral College and the Senate is sort of easy to illustrate, and it's common for everything. If one candidate racks up huge supermajorities in California and New York and a few other states, every vote above 50.1% is wasted. It does not put more points on the board for the Electoral College, right? But another candidate who just is lucky enough to more efficiently distribute the votes, getting bare majorities in lots of states, they may win overall, even though they have fewer total votes. In the Electoral College and in the U.S. Senate, this skew is actually aggravated by the fact that every state gets 2 Senate seats or at least two Electoral College votes, regardless of the population. So, a Wyoming person's vote for U.S. Senate counts 60 times more, mathematically, than a Californian's. Okay? Now, there are solutions to the Electoral College, and then there are partial solutions to the Senate. I'm not going to spend time talking about those because I have limited time. you could always buy the book. But what I'm going to focus on is even when we account for that and we have one person, one vote and the same exact number of people in every district, city council district, county commission district, state senate district, let's do U.S. House, it's the same problem. Right? Now, we all know that gerrymandering has been a problem for a long time. We are the only Western democracy left that still allows politicians to draw their own district lines. Right? And that is obviously a recipe for mischief. And I would be the first person to be in favor of getting rid of it. But I'm here to tell you that even if we do it, that won't be the total solution because we have an inherent flaw in our system. Since World War II, there's been an average of 6% deviation between the percentage of votes that a party gets and a percentage of seats. But that's average. There have been anomalous elections where the skew has really been great, right? And it is inevitable. And it's gotten worse in recent decades as our computer technology abilities to fine-tune our gerrymandering gets ever more precise. All right. We're familiar with the typical ugly gerrymander, the obvious one, right? This is the infamous 7th Congressional Pennsylvania District. It's the so-called goofy kicking Donald Duck district. That's what they call it. And that led to a counter-majoritarian result in the Pennsylvania congressional elections. But you know what else led to a counter-majoritarian result? And also led to a court challenge, the Gill case that the Supreme Court punted on last year? Is this one, where we went from the pre-existing to the gerrymandered plan. It's really quite lovely. You can be compact and still gerrymander. You can be compact and still create a skew. I think Judge Edelman was trying to make this point earlier today, if you were around for his excellent presentation. A lot of people say courts should come to the rescue. We should have judicial scrutiny of gerrymandering. Right now, racial gerrymanders are heavily policed by the courts. They can't wait to get their hands on a racial gerrymandering case, especially if it's the so-called reverse racial gerrymander, the affirmative action gerrymander, where we're helping minorities. The courts can't wait to roll up their hands and scrutinize those. But the court has said for some reason there's no judicially manageable standards to ever get involved in partisan gerrymanders, which are considered to be right now a non-justiciable political question. The court had a chance last year in Gill to change that. It punted. It's got 2 more chances this year in cases that are going to be argued this month out of North Carolina and Maryland. And I'm all for it. I think the court should get involved. But I'm here to tell you that won't solve the problem totally either, because they will inherently, because they're the courts getting involved in the political process, they will only be touching the most extreme gerrymanders, the most obvious ones. In fact, their legal doctrine says it has to be an intentional gerrymander. You have to prove intent. But there can also, as Judge Edelman was saying, there can also be, with the best of intentions, natural, accidental gerrymanders, where you have a partisan skew, and there is no smoking gun evidence of intent. So, some reformers say we should do nonpartisan redistricting commissions. Again, a great salutary effect. I'm all for it. Sign me up. It's still not going to totally solve the problem. Right? Well, there are all kinds of models around the country, internationally. I studied for a few months in Australia, where they have the gold standard. They have nonpartisan technocrats, disconnected from politics, drawing the lines. Right? They're widely respected, considered. Even they don't get it right all the time. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip some stuff, but there's also been experimentation at the state level. In recent years, lots of states are trying to do it. Some of them are better than others, but the results have been mixed. Right? One 2002 study showed that the partisan skew was reduced from almost 9% to almost 5% if you went from regular redistricting states to nonpartisan redistricting commission states. But remember, that's an average. Even in commission states, sometimes it was much higher than 4.7. And that's because there is an irreducible core of skew. Now, some of you may be thinking, 4.7% or a little bit higher, that's not that bad. But as we also heard earlier today, there are so many close elections in America that a 5% artificial advantage can be outcome determinative in all kinds of elections. So it's not a trivial thing. It is something we should worry about. And that's because the reason why it's an irreducible, unavoidable problem is a phenomenon that we call demographic clustering, also known as the big sort. Since World War II, there has been a slow-motion internal migration in the United States. People have been moving to different parts of the country, and accidentally sorting themselves by ideology. What this basically means is Democrats are clustering on the coasts and in big cities, and Republicans are clustering in suburbs and rural areas. So when you try to overlay compact, somewhat regular, artificial district lines over that, you're not going to get a perfectly representative map, right? It would be great if we could just make everyone decide to live and reside in nice, neat, organized clusters, proportional by party. But, stubbornly, they choose to live where they want. And as a result, we get imperfect districting maps, even with the best of intentions. Australia is a good example. I told you they're the gold standard, right? Internationally respected. And yet they've had counter-majoritarian results too. In 1990, the Liberal Party, which confusingly enough is actually their Conservative Party, got screwed over. They won a majority of the vote nationwide, but they lost control of the government. And they had a parliamentary system where the party that controls runs all the power. So it's really problematic for them. In 1998, it was the leftist Labour Party's turn to get screwed. There's even a state called South Australia that has in its constitution a requirement that its election commission make sure that there aren't counter-majoritarian results. It's constitutionally required. Even they have it happen, right? Despite the best of intention, because they've got demographic clustering too. Okay, there's a more fundamental issue here. Single-member districts with winner-take-all districts, winner-take-all elections will always lead to an inevitable gerrymander. There's no way around it. And also there's a tension between competitive districts and partisan fairness. So Judge Edelman, I think quite reasonably, was saying if you're going to have redistricting commissions, then maybe they should try to draw districts in which, if it's a 60% Republican state, then 6 out of 10 should be Republican majority districts, right? But the more you do that, then the less competitive the districts become, right? And if you don't have competitive districts, there's its own dysfunction, right? Because if you always know in advance, oh, I'm in the Republican district, the Republican's always going to win, then the Republicans think, well, I don't need to show up. My guy's going to win. And the Democrats think, I definitely don't need to show up. My vote won't count, right? And so it leads to lower voter turnout. The minorities in particular get disengaged and alienated. And then plus, the only competition occurs in the primary elections, right? So the Republican candidates have to outdo each other on the right, and the Democratic candidates have to outdo each other on the left in the primaries, because the general election's a foregone conclusion. What this means is that we get ever more partisan divide, and the incentive for bipartisan compromise plummets. Does this situation sound familiar to you? Right? There's a reason why it's happening, right? And it's inherent in our system. Add on to that the fact that besides partisan fairness and competitiveness, which are natural enemies, you've also got to make sure that you obey one person, one vote, and have every district exactly the same population. The Voting Rights Act says you've got to make sure you're fair for racial minorities and ethnic minorities, which I used to do for a living, so I'm totally on board with. And state rules say they have to be compact districts that can't split city and county lines too much. Something's got to give. You cannot do all of this at once. And usually the thing that's got to give is partisan fairness or competition. Okay. And so what we've done here is we have a system in which, under the winner-take-all construct, 50.1% of the vote gives you 100% of the power, and a consistent, repeated, year-in, year-out, politically cohesive minority, racial, ethnic, partisan, ideological, I don't care, gets nothing. And they eventually just stop showing up. Why not have a system in which 55% of the vote gets 55% of the power, and 40% of the vote gets 40% of the power? Proportional representation. It's not required, right? There's no constitutional guarantee, but there's no law saying we can't voluntarily adopt it. I'm going to skip this for the lack of time. This is just an explanation that shows that no matter how you draw the lines, you're going to get some sort of problem, either not competitive or you're going to get a partisan skew. All right, so under proportional representation, a majority of the votes always gets the majority of the seats. Significant minorities are never shut out of the process. They get their seat at the table as long as they get a certain minimum threshold, 10, 20, 30%. You can choose what that threshold is. They'll get at least one seat at the table, right? And elections have become more competitive, thus there's more turnout. So if you're not doing a winner-take-all, 100%, 0% thing, and you know you're in the minority, you're a Republican trapped in Massachusetts, say, right? Nonetheless, if you think of yourself as saying, well, actually, I'm not going to stay home because it's a foregone conclusion, because whether me and my people, whether we mobilize our base, could make the decision about whether we get 2 out of 5 or 3 out of 5 seats. Every election is at play. Every party always is motivated to mobilize. Voters are always motivated to show up because it's more likely mathematically that there could be a difference. Maybe I'll get 2 seats this time. Maybe I'll get 3 seats. I don't know. And also, historically, always better results for women. Female candidates always do better under proportional representation system in all jurisdictions throughout the West and in the United States as well. And there's also a phenomenon known as self-districting. So rather than have some map drawer in a room somewhere say, this is the Hispanic district, that's the Democratic district, that's the Republican district, and that's the African American district. And if you're African American over here or Democrat over there, sorry, you're screwed. Every voter gets to decide what's salient. They can vote on the basis of race, ethnicity, party ideology, GLBTQ status, position on the environment, whatever. It's self-districting. Australia is a natural example. For their house, their federal house, they have single-member district, winner-take-all. For their Senate, they have proportional representation. Year in, year out, the Senate has more proportional results, less partisan skew, no counter-majoritarian results. Third parties do better. It's a more vibrant system. It's not just two-party dominated. Historically, the Green Party tends to get 10 to 12% of the vote nationally in Australia. Under the House, with winner-take-all single-member district, they get 0% of the vote. Guess what percentage of the vote they get in the Senate with 10 to 12%? Anyone guess? It rhymes with bend to 12%. Right? It's proportional. And as a result, minor parties are not shunted to the side. Right? You don't say, oh, it's throwing away your vote. And plus, historically, both in Australia and Germany, which is another natural experiment as well, you get proportionality, you get better gender equity as well. In the United States, we'd have to structure it a little differently. We don't have a parliamentary system here. We like to vote for candidates, not for parties. We like to directly elect our chief executive, not have the legislature elect it. We like to have regularly scheduled elections, not votes of no confidence. People on my side of this equation are not suggesting that we move to a parliamentary system. But we can borrow from Australia to a certain extent and use their system to get proportional representation. There's a bill in Congress right now that would actually propose letting states do that. It's called the Fair Representation Act. And it would involve something called single transferable vote and ranked choice voting. Okay? And under that system, under ranked choice voting, you get to say, here's my first choice, here's my second choice, and here's my third choice. Right? It's not all or nothing when you go into the voting booth. And the advantage of that is that if somebody gets the minimum percentage they need to get 1 seat out of 5, let's say that's up for election, then any excess or surplus votes they get that would otherwise be wasted gets transferred to other candidates based on who their second choice is. And then if no one makes the minimum percentage in order to get one of those seats, then those candidates that are only getting 5, 7% or whatever, they're eliminated. And those ballots are transferred based on who those people had as their second choice, or if necessary, third choice. And you do multiple rounds, and then ultimately, mathematically, historically, always, you get roughly proportional results. Right? So under the Fair Representation Act, if you had 5 or fewer congressional seats, you just do it at large. Otherwise, you'd carve it up into 3 to 5 multi-member districts drawn by a nonpartisan redistricting commission. We would minimize or eliminate gerrymandering by minimizing or eliminating districting, recognizing that gerrymandering is inherent in districting. There are separate advantages to preferential voting. First choice, second choice, third choice. Right? And one of them is there's opportunities for minor parties. Right now, you don't want to vote for the Green Party or the Right to Life Party because you don't want to throw away your vote, right? Because you know they're not going to win. But with ranked choice voting, you can say, well, the Right to Life Party is my first choice and the Republican Party is my second. And actually, it's even worse than that, because under our system, not only are you throwing away your vote, you're actually helping to elect the guy you hate the most, right? A vote for Jill Stein is a vote for Donald Trump. A vote for Gary Johnson is a vote for Hillary Clinton. So never, ever consider third parties. Never, ever consider alternatives, right? You don't have that problem under ranked choice voting. Ralph Nader's my first choice. Al Gore's my second. This means that you also have opportunities for first-time, lesser-known, lesser-funded candidates. I really like that city council guy. He speaks to the issues that need to be spoken of, but he doesn't have name recognition, and he doesn't have, big money, big checks. So he doesn't really have a chance, so I can't throw away my vote on him. Sure you can. Give him a chance, and maybe he'll actually start to get traction, right? Because it's not all or nothing. First choice, second choice. Also positive campaigning. So if I'm in a ranked choice voting election with Professor Mazzo, right, I want to be the first choice of my base. I want to be the second choice of his base. So I'm not going to run that ad that says, Professor Mazzo beats his wife. Professor Mazzo cheats on his taxes. Don't vote for Professor Mazzo. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, I would love it if I was your first choice, but I can respect why you might like Professor Mazzo. He's a great guy, but I sure would love to be your second choice, right? And where it's worked around the world and in the United States, we see this. We see opportunities for minor parties. We see proportional results. We see female candidates doing better, and we see negative campaigning going down. I don't want to go over. I want time for questions, so I'm going to skip over the objections.
No, don't skip that.
Okay, so just quickly, people say it's too confusing and it's too hard to administer. There have been over 200 ranked choice voting elections in the United States over the last 20 years in over 15 jurisdictions, 12 major U.S. cities. The entire state of Maine uses it for all its federal elections. No documented history of voter confusion or election administration issues. They say, well, proportional representation is bad because it avoids local representation. We should have small neighborhood-based districts. Believe me, I'm for small neighborhood-based districts. I was the one that pushed for it in the last redistricting of the Shelby County Commission. But under PR, it's up to the voter. I can choose to vote for the guy that lives 5 blocks away because I want someone who's local and understands my local concerns. But if it's more important to me to vote for the pro-GLBTQ guy that lives 10 miles away, then I get to choose to do it, right? All right, and then finally they say it elects fringe candidates. You know, this is basically how you want to structure it. Under the Fair Representation Act, everyone needs at least 17 to 25% of the vote in order to get a seat at the table. Once you get to those percentages, I don't think they're fringe candidates. Finally, is it politically unfeasible? I will tell you this. A couple of decades ago, maybe it would have been, but every year, more and more jurisdictions in the United States are adopting ranked choice voting. We have had proportional representation of the single transferable vote in Cambridge, Massachusetts for the last 50 years and for the last 10 years in Minneapolis. So like a lot of election reforms, it may not happen tomorrow, but stay tuned. And I'll stop right there. Thank you. I was very mindful of the time, right? I mean, I rushed through it because I wanted there to be Q&A, so I've got time, right? Okay. All right. So, yes, questions?
A question about instant runoff voting. You
Yeah.
said that you will tally people's votes to where a candidate gets enough to definitely get a seat, and the rest of the people that voted for them, the vote goes to their second choice. So how do you determine which of the voters' vote goes to their second choice?
It's an excellent question, and I kind of rushed over it because of the time constraints. So instant runoff voting is the simplest example of ranked choice voting. That's when you're only electing one person. One mayor, one governor, one member in a single-member city council seat. That's the easiest example. If 50% or more is the threshold, if no candidate gets a majority, then you take the person who has the fewest votes, you knock them out, and then you take just their ballots, just the ballots for that candidate, and you say, all right, this person's second choice was you, this person's second choice was you, this person's second choice was you, and you keep shuffling, and you step back and you say, now does anybody have a majority? If yes, congratulations, you're the winner. If not, we eliminate the next weakest candidate, and you reshuffle, and then you declare a winner, right? That's easy. Single transferable vote is a little more complicated, okay? But then again, so is the Electoral College, right? You know, I bet you not everybody here, and this is an election law symposium, not every one of us could probably explain in all detail exactly how the Electoral College vote works. Nonetheless, we all consider ourselves qualified to walk in and vote in a presidential election, right? So, with that in mind, single transferable vote is a little more complicated. Let's say we're trying to elect we're going 5 seats, 5-seat multi-member district. Okay. Mathematically, the threshold is 1/6. As long as you get more than 1/6 of the vote, then mathematically you deserve at least 1 seat on the table, at the table. So anybody that gets more than 1/6 is seated, and then you've got these extra votes. Okay, and these surplus votes are the ones that are going to be redistributed based on second choices. Now, your question is, well, how do you pick which surplus votes, right? There's 2 methods. The Cincinnati method is a random draw of the ballots. Okay, it's purely random. There's also a method that's used in Australia called the fractional or proportional method, where you count all of the ballots, but you just count them based on a fraction. So their fraction of the total vote, they count a little bit less. And then you go to their second choices that way. And then, does anybody meet the threshold? Congratulations, we've now filled the second seat. If, at that point, no one meets the threshold, then it becomes like an instant runoff voting election, where you take the guy that has the fewest votes, you knock them out, and you take just those ballots, and you redistribute, right? And I know it sounds complicated, but this has worked. Okay, this has worked for over 70 years in Australia. It's worked for over 50 years in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There's a track record of success with this system. Yes?
President Mulroy, I know locally you ran into the issue with African American representation in the NAACP coming out against it.
Yep.
How would, candidates position African American with argument?
It's an excellent question, and what he's referring to is we went for instant runoff voting, where you're just electing one person at a time per district in Memphis, and there's been a series of referenda, the people constantly voting for it, and the politicians constantly doing everything they can to obstruct implementation. That's a whole other story. The NAACP did endorse it the first time back in 2008, and then they did not endorse it most recently in 2018, and I can let them answer for that, but I will tell you this. There were African American incumbents on the city council who lobbied hard to get them to change their position. And they argued that it would hurt African Americans in Memphis because African Americans would be more likely to be confused than other voters when it came to, and we only allowed 3 choices. Their argument was African American voters could not handle first choice, second choice, third choice. Even though African American voters in other cities around the country, including Oakland, where they have African American majority districts, successfully use it over and over without any record of confusion. And that was their argument. He said, we don't think that Memphis voters or Memphis African American voters are any less able to handle this than African American or American voters anywhere in the United States. And I think the fact that African American incumbents were pressuring them so hard had a lot to do with it. But of course, you can let them answer that question for themselves. Okay, we have time for one more question. Yes.
Okay. Also, it was looked at, it was only going to be done for the city council, right?
Correct.
Okay. And also, who counts those votes? Does the machine do it, or do people do it?
You can do it either way. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, they have a manual count with paper ballots and a paper record, right? So it's transparent. There are other jurisdictions where the same computers that they use to do the other elections are used to do the ranked choice voting elections. Here in Memphis, the election administrator has said that at least the first time we would do it in 2019, she was going to do it the transparent way with paper records of the ballot images and a manual counts where the press and others could observe. There are several different models that are used around the country, and it all depends on your view of election security, I guess.
It's also illegal in the state of Tennessee, isn't that correct?
No, it is not. We have Mark Goins, the same person that gave Audrey so much of a hard time recently, has issued an opinion letter that under the particularities of Tennessee state law, instant runoff voting, then we're getting a little bit far afield from my PowerPoint, but it's okay. Instant runoff voting does not comport with that. However, There's an opinion letter from the county attorney for Shelby County that advised the Election Commission in 2008. The attorney that advised the Charter Commission back in 2008 that there was no state law problem. And we currently are in litigation right now. We have law firm opinion letters that have thoroughly researched this and said there is no actual conflict with Tennessee state law. So stay tuned. We're going to let the courts decide that. Okay? All right, thank you.